I'd now like to welcome myself back up on stage. For this presentation, I wanted to focus on some of the practical outcomes of what happens on the ground with growth area development, and just run through an example of a situation in Melbourne's north where a section of road has been missing since 2003, resulting in major congestion in and around the surrounding suburb. The suburbs continue to develop. There's been shopping centre developments, there's been a big hospital built up, there's been 20 or 30,000 people arrive over that period of time, and the road network is pretty much still as it was in the 1970s when I grew up there, with remnant roads and inadequate intersections. The second case study that I'll present is a much better example of where a developer approached me earlier this year to help him engage with local government, the state government, and local bus operators to help facilitate a new bus service into a growing area out in the western suburbs. So just in terms of a bit of context, Melbourne's, as we saw yesterday, Melbourne's growth areas are quite extensive. If you were to get your scale rule out and draw from the edge of Cardinia Shire across to Mountain Shire, you'd stretch it about 120 kilometres across, so it's a massive area. The first case study's in Epping North at a place called Aurora, and I'll get into the details in a little while. And the second case study is at a place called Rockbank, famously described by the CEO of the VPA as having nothing but rocks and dead sheep a few years ago. So, I'll just catch up to my notes, sorry. So Aurora was first planned and approved in 2003. It was accompanied by a development contributions plan that was supposed to fund the construction of roads and intersections, among other things. It included funding for land reserves needed to develop the roads, and Development Victoria, the state government's development agency, was responsible for delivering the section of road to the north. The southern section of the road was owned by a landowner who wasn't a developer, but held out for quite some time. Late last year, a developer managed to purchase that block, and that was what enabled the area to move forward. Just in terms of context, the areas of Epping North is home to about 8,800 homes, and that represents about 25,000 people. More broadly, the Epping North area is home to roughly 25,000 people, and that's been rapidly expanding over the last 25 years. The slide there on the screen is a graphical depiction of the impact of that missing section of road, and you can see it there. It's quite obvious that traffic's coming off of the Craigieburn bypass, heading east towards Epping, and then without any other options, it congregates along High Street, heading north to the new growth areas, but a lot of overflow hits Miller Street, which runs through an industrial precinct and through some neighbourhoods. The situation's been like that since about 2005 and has been rapidly getting worse. Despite having the best laid plans and a development plan requiring the delivery of these sections of road, it's still missing. Towards the end of last year, it got to the point where local government was at its wit's end in terms of what to do. The state government had announced an arterial road funding package called OSARS, which was designed to deal with situations where arterial roads needed massive upgrades, and it provided an injection of funding. The O'Hearns Road package introduced a diamond interchange onto the Craigieburn bypass for east-west traffic, funded the duplication of O'Hearns Road up to High Street, and also included a number of intersections. What it didn't include was Edgars Road, which is the north-south section of road there, the crossing as a dotted line. Sorry, I didn't. My labels haven't worked. The state government was forced to intervene when local government started to complain to the local members. The local member wasn't quite sure what to do about it. The road should have been funded out of local government funding in terms of the funds it was able to collect from developer contributions. It was a local road. The problem was that it was asking the state government to intervene. As a planning officer at the Victorian Planning Authority, I got a phone call from the Minister's office one day saying, "You know about this sort of stuff, fix it." So I sat down with the developers, the local government, and said, "Okay, so what's the problem here?" And it was all about coordination. Nobody had actually sat down and discussed how they were going to deliver the road. Vic Roads was now involved through the fact that OSARs existed, and people were worried that OSARs would build O'Hearns Road without considering intersections or the connections to Edgars Road. So we sat down and worked through a program of how to try and fix that. So that describes the responsibilities. Vic Roads was responsible for the O'Hearns Road package, Development Victoria for the north section, City of Whittlesea responsible for the sections to the south in terms of developer contributions, and that was mainly to do with the intersection. And the new landowner, MAB, was responsible for delivering the road south of O'Hearns Road. That was the base case, that was the baseline from which we worked. The outcome was that we were able to get Development Victoria signed up to a Section 173 agreement, which required them to deliver that section of road before they divested out, and that put some constraints around timing as to when they could start, when they needed to deliver that by. Vic Roads agreed to plan and design the intersection with contributions from the developers, and MAB agreed to deliver the section of road with some concessions in relation to open space requirements. Out of just for context, the southern section of Edgars Road there, south of O'Hearns Road, is an industrial precinct, so the open space wasn't such a critical issue in terms of community amenity. And you can see there that the southern section of Edgars Road, south of the yellow section there, is already constructed. Sorry, that's just a repeat of that slide. So the lessons learned really were despite the best intentions of the development plan, nobody was keeping watch of this situation, and it was allowed to develop and build up to the extent that it became a real problem. It meant that bus services were missing from the area because they were unviable. To try and send a bus along those existing remnant roads would just be pointless, because it wouldn't be able to get anywhere because it would just be in the line with the rest of the traffic. As a result of the inaction, a number of stakeholders, I've said that bit, sorry. In terms of the broader road network, the Road Authority works on a predict and provide model. And by that I mean they look at the number of trips, the number of vehicles per day, and they work that into an overall model of the road network. They allow for certain tolerances, which means that on paper, if a road is coping with 15 or 20,000 vehicles a day, it's probably okay. It doesn't deal with the on-the-road issue. In my view, I'd like to see transport planning and growth area planning move to more of an objectives-based model, whereby if we turned around and said, well, we want to achieve a certain thing by 2020, we need to do X, Y, and Z. It's a much better model in terms of making sure that we're not getting our roads to saturation point before we're providing infrastructure upgrades. The second case study is a bit more positive. As I said at the start, it's located out at Rockbank North, and this is really a developer-led initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, I'll just go, sorry. Sorry, just having a bit of... So Rockbank North is, it was approved as a PSP, a precinct structure plan, back in 2012, and has been developing rapidly since. Woodley are a subsidiary of Mirvac and have been developing the area. The suburb itself will, it's just west of Caroline Springs, and will develop to become a pretty significant area in terms of the volume of homes there. I've got some, sorry, my slide order is not, and now I'm having issues, sorry. I don't know what's happened here, I've lost my notes. Sorry. Just to give you the context here. Anyway, I'll move on. It's big. So really what's made this whole thing possible is the Growth Area Infrastructure Contribution. It was a tax that was introduced back in 2010 to provide about 15% of the state's infrastructure needs for expanding fringe suburbs. It's a one-off contribution payable on certain projects, usually associated with urban property development, and these include the buying and selling, subdividing and building permit applications. At a rate of roughly $110,000 per hectare, GAIC is expected to generate around $900 million over the next 5 years. And this will be contributed to a range of projects. The money is divided into two buckets. Half of it goes into the Public Transport Fund, and half of it goes into building new communities. The New Communities Fund really focuses on the delivery of schools, community facilities such as regional sports facilities and so on. And you can see there that the Public Transport Fund can be used for a range of initiatives, in particular the funding of new bus services as an operational expense for the first 5 years of that operation. And that's where we really got the idea for funding this new service out at Rockbank. So this is an excerpt from the Network Area Plan. Services are pretty sparse. There's really only one service operating between Melton and Caroline Springs to Sunshine, and that's the 456. It runs on a fairly infrequent timetable, and its span is not very long. To some degree it replicates the train line, but the train line is not an electrified train, it's a V-line diesel, which I think runs hourly in the peak in the mornings and afternoons. Caroline Springs was developed during the 1990s as part of the Taylor Hills area and has pretty much finished its cycle. But there's a bit of a gap between it and Rockbank, so Rockbank was able to leapfrog the sequence of development, which has caused a few concerns as well. In terms of the service we were seeking to get funded, the alignment of the service was really a straightforward proposition where we tried to link it to the recently renovated Rockbank station, back through the development and hooking it into Caroline Springs. And the idea of that is that it would provide an augmentation of services that currently come from the east out to Caroline Springs and give people a greater connection opportunity. It's a work in progress. We've had good support from the state government in terms of having it approved, but with the state election coming up, it's stalled a bit. There's a bit of a glut of announcements coming at the moment, so we're in the line, but we think it'll be picked up again after the election. Going back to the conversation about the missing section of road, there's a bridge that needs to be built as part of this. Part of our initiative was to demonstrate to government that we're able to deliver that 4-lane section of bridge that crosses Koroit Creek. And that's a pretty important thing. That'll create that connection back to the east, and as part of the Woodley's development plan, that'll be delivered early and is due for completion in 2020. Lessons learned in this situation is that, and from the other presentations that we've seen as well, there's local government resources are fairly stretched, to say the least. There's not a lot of capacity there to take on these big projects. So it's really up to, I think, developers and bus operators to work together to come up with ways of delivering services sooner, and to put that to government as a proposition. If you get out there and tell the government that this is what's needed in the area, and there's a united voice coming from local government, from developers, and from bus operators, so that it might be enough to make them sit up and listen. Because my observations over the last 20 years has been that the critical mass has not been great enough for it to be enough of a concern for state government. The population debate is now fully front and centre on the federal, state and local government agendas, and we need to do more, be more proactive about changing the dynamic and changing the paradigm in which we operate. Rather than just letting it be, we need to get in front of it and make sure that services are delivered as a priority, particularly when there's funding available. So that concludes the presentations. I think we're now going to have some opportunity